thank Frank and Ben in the center, and I appreciate the chance to come and talk about China. A lot of what I do now is related to China. I do want to say that I address these issues almost inevitably more like a former senator than a scholar. So don't tell them at AEI that I said I'm not a scholar, but I don't read Mandarin. I didn't serve in the Pacific the way Peter Brooks, who's also on the commission, did. But so I try and look at this from the standpoint of a policymaker. And part of what I do at AEI and have done since I left the Senate is to translate what experts in various areas are saying about defense into a lexicon that my former colleagues can understand and relate to. And so I'm going to try and do that with you today. I have what I'm going to say today is very similar to what I wrote in 2 articles for National Review now about a year and a half ago. So maybe, Joel, if you'll take those 2 folders and pass them around, and if you take one out of each, you're going to have the substance of my remarks, and in fact, you might just finish your lunch and then get up and leave and read the articles later. And Frank asked me to talk a little bit about the defense budget, which I'll do. So I'm going to try and move pretty quickly, and I like to keep these things informal, and I expect you do as well, and it's a good setting to do that. So China. And if you want to figure out, I think, what is going on with China and what we ought to do in response, you have to first ask, what are they trying to achieve and why? And what should we be trying to achieve and why, particularly in that region? This is a huge failing of our foreign policy, is a failure to define what it is we're trying to protect and or what objectives we're trying to achieve. You can't decide how you're going to get someplace until you know where you want to go. And another big failing is the tendency to look at the powers with whom we are competing, and what we're in with China is a strategic competition, and to assume that they really are deep down just like we are, and they really want the same things we want. And that's tremendously patronizing to them, particularly to people like the Chinese, who, of course, an ancient Chinese with an ancient country with a proud national history. They have objectives of their own, and they are rationally trying to achieve those objectives, and they're very important to them. And if we don't understand that, we're not going to understand where their objectives conflict with our interests and what we need to do to try and deter them and either reconcile that conflict or succeed in a competition with them. So let's look at the Chinese. And I'm going to move quickly, but they are engaged in a major, and in fact, you might almost say unprecedented military buildup, and have been so engaged in it for the last 20 years. Double-digit increases in the defense budget. I talk about some of the elements of that buildup in the article. It is now, in fact, it has for the last 5 to 7 years really been coming to fruition. It has achieved the stage, it has achieved a point, progress in what they're doing. That they're able to use that tool in support of their tactics and their objectives in the East and South China Sea, which is exactly what they're doing. So and I say in the article, they're going to have, if they don't already, by 2020, a Navy composed of modern multi-mission vessels that is larger than the entire United States Navy, and of course they can concentrate that power and all of this power in their near seas. It's important when you think of their military capabilities to understand the enormous logistical advantage they have in any prospective conflict or confrontation in the East and South China Sea. It takes 2 to 2.5 weeks to steam from the west coast of the United States to the East and South China Sea. They will be able to assemble power in a matter of days, and since one presumes that they'll be the person starting the country starting the confrontation, they'll have the lead time, and we won't. I'm not going to go through everything, but it's comprehensive. 2 elements I should note. The Defense Science Board concluded early in 2013 that they have the ability to inflict existential damage on the United States through cyber. And we've seen some of that, for example, with the OPM espionage that they were able to engage in. They're very interested in space. If you read the Chinese documents, they understand that the next, and they just say this, the next conflict is going to be fought out. It's going to be an information war, domination of of the information sphere, and that space is a hugely important part of that, and they're developing the ability, and will have it if they don't have it already, to successfully destroy or severely disrupt America's space architecture in every orbital regime, okay? So, but the best way to think of this, if you're fairly new to this, and I know a lot of people around here are not, is that what they are building is a missile-centric military. America's adversaries have figured out that we have an asymmetric vulnerability to missiles. And the scenario, and the point of it is to be able to deny the United States access to their near seas in the event of a confrontation anytime they want to. So the scenario they're aiming towards is one where, let's say, there's some confrontation with Taiwan. In 1997, President Clinton sent an aircraft carrier task force up and down the Taiwan Straits. It was very humiliating from them. They've studied that and they've learned from it. So now a president who seeks to do that, and remember, virtually the entire surface firepower of the United States Navy is concentrated in its carrier task forces. So now you send the task force in there, and the aircraft carrier captain faces the very real prospect of scores of Chinese missiles coming at that carrier from all different directions. Some of them cruise missiles, some of them ballistic missiles. So all different directions and trajectories. So they can threaten a $10 to $12 billion carrier with a package of missiles that costs them a couple $100 million. That is an asymmetric vulnerability. And they are thinking in terms of what that does to the chain of command and the thinking. So their thinking is, an American president is not going to risk that. And if they get to the point, they reach the stage where the disproportion, the balance, if you will, is shifted far enough in their direction, you can see the risk that it will encourage them to trigger the confrontation that could lead to the escalation. So it's that deterrent, it's that calculus that all this has to be designed to affect. And they are thinking in these terms, and they're being pretty explicit about it. So what are they using that power to do? They are using it in support of a tactic which is designed to achieve at least first de facto sovereignty, and after that de jure sovereignty over their near seas out to what they call the second dash line, which includes, by the way, Guam. Okay? So it's virtually the entire East and South China Sea. So what they do is they confront their neighbors over these disputed territories in such a way where they simply exercise the rights of sovereignty as if they were the uncontested sovereign, and present their neighbors with the choice of either acceding to that as a practical matter or starting a shooting war with against a locally dominant, a regionally dominant military power. This is how they took the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. They just took it. So what are you going to do if you're the Philippines? You shoot. Now, they are responsible for the escalation, right? And if there's a military confrontation, they're going to get destroyed. So it's actually, it's a tailored strategy. It was called originally coercive but non-kinetic. Of course, it's only non-kinetic because it works, right? So they trigger these things. The same thing with the oil rigs near the Spratlys in territories that Vietnam claimed, which they didn't have any right to do. But what's Vietnam going to do about it with the Chinese Coast Guard, which they're arming more and more, and the Chinese Navy looming in the background? Same thing with the reefs that they are reclaiming and the islands they're building. They have no right to do that under international law, but they're doing it and presenting their neighbors and the United States with a fait accompli. So at the end of the day, they have the islands. We haven't recognized it, but they have it. One of the advantages of this for them, and we have to think in these terms, is that they're almost no-lose tactics. The worst that happens to them is they don't gain ground. They may get everything they want. They may get part of what they want, but they don't lose any ground. They've declared air identification zones over the East China Sea, which only a sovereign can do, and asserted the right to control who can fly within that zone. So they're acting like the sovereign of the East and South China Sea, and they're using their power to coerce their neighbors into accepting it de facto. Now, why are they doing that? There's three sets of reasons. I'll move through them quickly. The first is economic and strategic. They want to control, they want to dominate their strategic environment. Fair enough. By the way, these are not I would not call these evil reasons. I mean, this is how authoritarians act, okay? So they want to control their strategic dominion. They want to control the resources in the East and South China Sea. And that's going to become increasingly important to them as their economic growth declines, which I think is almost inevitable, right? They're going to look for ways to try and create growth without having to convert to a free market economy, which in my judgment, the Chinese Communist Party will never do for a set of reasons we can talk about if you want to. So economic and strategic is one set. Another, and it's important to understand this, is nationalistic and historical. Okay, China has historically been the middle kingdom in Asia, and that's how they view themselves. And what does that mean? It means that they are in various stages of dominance over their neighbors. Another way of looking at it is their neighbors are in different stages of vassalage to China. That's what they see as their natural role. It's what historically they do. And the other thing to remember, I had a Japanese scholar put this to me, and I thought it was very nice. He said, you got to remember, he said, we think of the world horizontally, and they think of it vertically. So horizontally, in the sense, the United States has created an international set of regimes, or an international order, if you want to call it that, where the presumption is that nations relate to each other according to norms, and that therefore the smaller countries have more or less the same rights as the bigger countries. Now, I know it doesn't work that way a lot of the time, but that's the basic system that the United States and its allies have created over the years and believe in. Chinese don't believe in that system. That's a horizontal system. They believe in a vertical system, where the big dogs get the benefits in their sphere of influence, which, to be fair to them, is how nations have related to each other through most of human history, right? And they view this as their sphere of influence. So when Xi Jinping talks about a new great power relationship with the United States, that's what he's talking about. He's saying, this is ours, and you need to let us have it. So economic and strategic, nationalistic and historical, and then finally, and probably most importantly, political. The nature of how the Chinese Communist Party views the way it is going to stay in power. And make no mistake, nothing is more important to the leaders of China than the stability of their own regime. Now, they understand that, that to stay in power, they need a combination of repression, but also a certain degree of legitimacy. They're not going to get that legitimacy through creating democratic institutions. It's absolutely clear. It was clear before Xi Jinping. It is now absolutely clear. In fact, if somebody in the Communist Party leadership suggests that, they go to jail, right? So they know they have to create some sense of legitimacy a different way, and they do that by delivering to their people a better quality of life, and by delivering to them a reassertion, a reemergence of China's place, in particular in Asia and more broadly in the world. It's national pride. It's really a species of the classic authoritarian tactic of directing dissent outwards. Putin does it all the time, right? It's a lot more sophisticated with the way the Chinese do it. It actually has a much stronger historical basis, but that's basically what it is. So one of the things that means that we have to think about is that there's a big upside to them of being successful in these tactics, but a huge downside to them if they're not. Okay, because if they lose one of these confrontations, they see it as affecting regime stability. And there's both good and bad aspects to that we can play. So those are the three interests. They define them as vital, and what that means is they're going to continue doing this. It is a successful set of tactics that is helping them accomplish their objectives, which are based on their view of their vital national interests. And so, as I say, there's no reason whatsoever to believe that they're going to stop until that calculus is changed. And it has to be changed in part through deterrence. Now, what are America's interests? I can move through these pretty quickly. Freedom of trade and travel in the region. That's a vital interest of the United States generally in foreign policy. All you got is every time America's right to travel on equal terms with other countries has been disturbed, particularly by force, we've ended up in a war. I mean, going back to the War of 1812, it's one of the big reasons we got in that one, right? So this is an important, a huge national interest of the United States that's clearly at stake. We don't know what they'll do with this sphere of influence, by the way, if they become fully established in it. But we know that they're going to reserve the right to do whatever a sovereign would do. Second, we have alliance commitments in the region. And not only is it a matter of honor, but one of the operating principles by which America has run its foreign policy since the end of World War II is developing and nurturing alliances with countries that have communities of interest. So if we are seen as a result of one of these confrontations as not living up to our alliance commitments, America's global foreign policy could collapse. And so what was really a means, alliances are typically a means to an end, becomes, as a practical matter, an end of policy. We can't just abandon the Japanese, for example, if under our defense treaty with them we are called upon to defend them because of the implications more broadly. And then finally, the United States, it's the other side of what I was saying about how China views historically relations among nations. We don't view relations among nations that way. The system that has been created largely by American power and initiative is one that comports with our values and under which we have, generally speaking, prospered. And this is one of the reasons I say is you can always tell a vital national interest, because if it's sufficiently threatened, any administration has to at least try to defend it, even the Obama administration. And which is why, what does the administration say over and over again is our goal is the peaceful resolution of these disputes according to international norms or negotiations, because that's our view of the world. And the Chinese keep coming back and saying, no, that's not how things are going to operate in the East. And so you have this clash of this broader visions with a lot at stake for the United States. What do we do to deal with this? Understand we are in a strategic competition. A lot of people hoped that China would not develop in that direction, that China would not see its relationship with the United States as a zero-sum game, but they largely do. And it may be possible over time to get them back to that other point of view, but not if they see themselves as winning the competition with the United States. So we have to compete effectively with them. Generally speaking, I say to people, our policy ought to be, if I was the president, talk to your boss when he comes in for a vote. I would tell my foreign policy establishment, look, generally, here's what you want to think in these terms. You want to think in terms of deterring them without provoking them. Okay? The Chinese are a proud people. We should not show disrespect to them or to their history. Showing disrespect to the Chinese Communist Party, however, is a tool that we should be prepared to use under the proper circumstances. But to China, the Chinese people, no. And one of my concerns about Obama's policy is by constantly presenting ourselves as the obstacle to their ambitions, without backing it up with sufficient power and presence in the region, we are effectively provoking them without deterring them. We are telling them, you're going to have to remove us to get what you want, and we're getting weaker and weaker to make it possible for you to do it. Remember the last time we did that with a rising Asian power in the 1930s, and what happened? These are the kind of calculations. I'm not saying I don't think they want war with the United States. They want to achieve what they want to achieve without war. But the greater the risk grows, the greater the miscalculation grows. So deter without provoking. And by the way, we respect them. We should insist, make a point, even if we don't particularly care about something, on insisting respect from them. So if we send an admiral to a conference and the Chinese send a general, and the general gets up and spends 20 minutes with the most outlandish kinds of distortions about the United States in a really offensive way, you have to react to that. You have to impose costs of some kind on them for that. You don't just sit there with a frozen smile on your face and not say anything. Now again, how you respond, that's something that depends on the case, but you've got to respond, because if you don't, you are sending a message to them. They take what we say and do seriously. I like to say this about other leaders in other countries take what the American government says and does seriously, even though our people don't. If the United States every year conducts a naval exercise called RIMPAC, which we lead, and we invite allied countries to send ships there, right? And because it's an expression, again, of our view of how countries ought to relate, it's a really good thing to do. Well, we invited the Chinese. They sent ships. They sent an intelligence ship that right in the middle of the exercise was trying to get data from our other ships. Now, that was a thumb in our eyes. And we should need to respond. Look, if you don't want to come, don't come. But don't come to our RIMPAC exercise and use it to exploit intelligence. We know what you're doing. You want us to respect you, you respect us. Now, that's not, you don't necessarily say that publicly. I'm just saying the message you have to send to them is, no, we're not going to stand for that. This constant talking about, and Randy Forbes will go ballistic on this, about the mill-to-mill exchanges where we think by sending officers to talk to them, we can somehow change this policy which is based on their interests. Again, it's a patronizing attitude towards them. So when we do mill-to-mill exchanges, and I'm not against that, but we ought to have objectives we're trying to accomplish when we go into those kinds of discussions. Things we're trying to learn, messages we're trying to send that are consistent with the objectives we're trying to achieve. That's what they do. When we constantly, we're so eager to do, we're so eager to talk, we're sending a message to them that causes them to lose respect for us. So there's that, and then there's the whole, that's the don't provoke, but insist that they respect us. But then the other side of this is deterrence. Now, deterrence, if you think of the Soviet model, I know Frank knows a lot about this. I mean, there's a whole science and doctrine of deterrence in the context of the Soviet-American competition that was developed over the decades. And we need to do that here. And it needs to be specific and tailored to them. And we haven't really done it, in part because we've only recently admitted or even been willing to confront the fact that we are in a competition with them. So this is subject, there's a lot of specifics that you have to work out. But generally speaking, what you want is a situation where you have a lot of options. Presidents or PACOM commanders, depending on the level of it, has a lot of options to impose costs for coercive actions that the Chinese will view as greater than the benefits they're likely to get from those actions. And most of the time, that cost imposition is going to be through obviously non-military types of things. Reputational costs to the Chinese, economic costs. And the Obama administration has done some good things in this area. Whatever you think of TPP as a economic tool, and I'm not saying it's a good treaty, but the idea of an explicit greater economic cooperation between the United States and the neighbors, China's neighbors, is a way of sending a message to them, because part of their goal is to wean those countries away from us. So in concept, that's a good thing. I think the agreement with the Philippines, very smart. We're going to base, if we have the troops, if we have the forces, we're going to base them in the Philippines. That's very good. This is the one area of the world, I'll say this even to this group, where the policy the administration has been followed is at least in the ballpark, compared to, for example, the Middle East or Eastern Europe. But where it has failed is, I say, and I said in this article, it's failing for want of power. The balance of power in the Far East is shifting because the United States is getting weaker militarily and the Chinese are getting stronger. I mean, it comes down to that. Now, where that balance is, whether it's shifted far enough to empower them to do more, I don't know. It's empowering them to do things that are very dangerous right now. We also got to understand we're facing a leader, Xi Jinping, who is the strongest leader they've had since Deng Xiaoping and views himself that way. And if he decides he's going to live within the 10-year limit, he came in 2013, so if he decides he's going to leave in 2023, I think there's a very good chance that he's going to want to do something pretty dramatic in this area before he goes. There's a lot of indications that 2020 is an important date for them and in their thinking. So now we get to the second subject Frank wanted to discuss, and I think I can cover a little bit in the context of China. There is nothing, there is no single step, in my judgment, that the United States government could take that would more favorably affect our standing and our interests and our security in more parts of the world, including the Far East, than an urgent, purposeful, Reagan-like buildup of the American military. Even insofar that as that's not, that money isn't put into things that are immediately relevant to the Far East, it'll have a huge impact on Beijing. I mean, if you fast forward a year and the new president announces he's changing the outgoing administration's budget and asking for a double-digit increase in the baseline for Congress to do away with the budget control caps, going to stop the reduction in end strength in the Army, going to put a 50% increase in naval shipbuilding. If that announcement is made and it's responded to on the Hill in a favorable way, particularly if you can achieve some measure of bipartisan support for it, I mean, the lights go on at 2 a.m. In the Standing Committee of the Chinese Politburo. And, oh, the Americans are coming back. And think of the impact in Manila, in Tokyo. Think of the impact on the Australians. Think of what that does in terms of any outreach to Vietnam, the credibility of American leadership in the region, even before you've said what you're going to do with it. And you could, and it would be smart to do this, to accompany this with on a diplomatic track, and to send the ambassador in to back channel his Chinese counterpart. You don't say this publicly, but you say, look, you want to get in a competition with us? We've done that before. This is what this has gotten you. You know, we were patient. We tried. We gave you the benefit of every doubt in terms of your motives. We have interests too. And here's what they are. And we're not abandoning them. So that's even before you get into what particular systems or tactics or the rest of it you're going to do. This is one of the reasons AEI just issued one of our reports, and we're trying to move the goalposts for the Congress in terms of, look, this is what the force needs to look like when you finally get serious about building it. And one of the things we recommend, and reasonable people can disagree about this, if Senator McCain was here, he'd get up, but is reopen the F-22 line. Just the announcement, we're reopening F-22. Oh. It costs $500 million. But see, my argument is that $500 million buys so much in terms of deterrence. F-22 is a game changer. Another good one to do. We're going to increase, we think the shipyards can do it, and we're going to increase the buy of Virginia-class submarines from 2 a year to maybe 3 a year if we could get there, or 5 every 2 years. Virginia-class. It's the deadliest undersea platform in the world. I mean, when we still have an advantage in the undersea domain. Where do you think we're going to put those? And then you send that message, and you send the message to the allies the same way. So maybe at this point you've negotiated with the South Koreans, who the Chinese are hoping and trying to wean away from us, to start saying some really favorable things. And this message starts to hit. Now, specifically, I mean, obviously, you need to do something. You need to do things that reduce the costs they can impose on you in the event of conflict, and increase the costs that they think credibly you can threaten to impose on them. And this is hugely important. We need to try and structure the policy so that in the event of a confrontation, we have responses that, again, I'm going to use the word, are horizontal rather than vertical. Because if the only response you have is a highly escalatory response, number one, you don't want to do it. And number two, the Chinese know you don't want to do it. This is the problem with air-sea battle as a concept for those of you who study this, in my opinion. And again, reasonable people can disagree about this. But war moves very quickly nowadays. In other words, the idea of hitting first is hugely important when you're talking about like space satellites and this sort of thing. And so if air-sea battle basically amounts to, well, here's what we can do, Mr. President. We can take out their missiles before they can shoot them in our aircraft carrier. And the President says, you know, it's President Cruz in day one. He doesn't know everything yet. So he says, okay, how are we going to take out those missiles? Where are they? Well, a lot of them are on the east coast of China. So what you're saying is we have to bomb the Chinese mainland? This is our response to them trying to take the second Thomas Shoal from the Philippines? Is the president going to do that? Probably not. And they know he's not going to do it. So that's not, and again, this is the deterrence thinking. So no, you need other options. So harden the infrastructure on our air bases so that it's harder for them to take them out, right? They have a lot of land-based cruise missiles. Why don't we get some cruise missiles? Now, there's a problem with the arms treaty with Russia. We got to work our way around that. But you station these cruise missiles in key choke points. So you can threaten, again, you don't want to do this, but now we're taking out a ship out in the middle of the ocean. So it's a much more proportionate sort of response. And then there's a whole set of things you can do to impose costs on them reputationally. Dan Blumenthal at AEI had an idea that I was very intriguing. Now, you got to think it through. But our position on these South China Sea disputes has been, we don't have a position on who ought to have what. We just want it resolved peacefully. Well, what if we began a diplomatic endeavor, and along with these other things going on in a parallel track, where we said, you know, these disputes have been festering for a long time. They're causing a lot of problems. You'd have to work with the neighboring countries to get them to do this. But we're going to start an initiative to resolve them. And that's probably going to be a cluster of different negotiations between 2 or 3 countries in different parts under the aegis and the umbrella of American leadership, or it might be America and another country. I mean, however you want to do it, right? And you say to the Chinese, look, if you want to participate, fine. Love to have you. But if you don't want to participate, we're still going to do it. We might submit some of them to arbitration or something. You know, countries decide. This is how we do things, and we're going to do it this way. And whatever the result is, we're going to recognize. Now you put them in a position where either they participate, in which case they are acquiescing in our view of international relations, or they don't participate, in which case they are isolated, not just as against the United States, but as against these other countries. Now, whether that would work or not, I don't know. Those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. This is a long-term thing. We don't want it to escalate, but we don't want to give up our vital national interests either. So, in summation, and I do this in in one of the pieces, the United States, if you step back and look at it, and this is one of the broader problems we have here with national security, Frank, is that we are going through one of these periods of time where everybody views us, everybody in this town tends to view the United States, we're so helpless, this is so difficult, we can't do anything. You know, these are challenges, you know, but they're fully within our capabilities to do. You know what AEI wants to spend on the baseline defense budget, and we are like, in saying this, we're like the most aggressive in town. You know what we think we ought to be spending? What it works out to what we need to spend, about 4% of the gross domestic product. Now we're spending a little under 3%. So another 1 out of the $100 we think that the United States produces, we ought to spend on the baseline, sustaining the military, not operations abroad, not wars, just on building up the military. Now I'm going to go over and brief House members on this, and I am going to get the question, how can we afford it? One of the things I'm going to say to them is, look, how can we afford it? Don't make a choice masquerade as a necessity. There is no economist in this country, from Paul Krugman to Milton Friedman, God rest his soul, who would say a nation of America's size and affluence and wealth cannot afford to spend 4% of its product on the armed forces. You may not want to, but recognize that's what you're doing. Now, I know we have fiscal problems, but it's not in that part of the budget. We're like a family that has a fair income, but has been spending 60% of it a year on shelter, let's say. And so we're running out of money. And we haven't been spending enough on food and clothing for the kids. And so what do? We get a family meeting together and we say, how can we cut the food and clothing budget more? The first thing you got to do if you're that family is you got to say, look, the problem, it's not an overall budgetary problem, is how much we're spending on shelter. And we need to either find a way to reduce that cost or get more income somehow. And that's as neutral a way as I know how to say it. I would say that to a group of liberals. And this is what we're doing up here. So when people say, well, what about the fiscal problem? I say, you can't solve a problem until you recognize with some precision what it is. And the problem we have is the gap between what we're collecting for the entitlement programs and what we're spending on the entitlement programs. That's the problem. So what we've done to the defense budget, what they've done and Obama's done, is not a solution to the fiscal problem. It's a symptom of the fiscal problem, isn't it? It's what they're doing because they can't or won't deal with the other problem. So I say to people, look, this is a choice you are making. Don't kid yourself that it's not a choice you're making. And it's a choice that's disastrous for the country. I'll close by saying this, and you can ask about the defense. The President's Defense Submission does nothing. It's I think, a total of $3 billion above what he offered last year, and less, about $14 billion less than what he said last year he would need for this year. Okay? The inconsistencies, the contradictions, over and over again, they've done things which have to be wrong because they have themselves said at different times that they were wrong. All this began in 2011 when Bob Gates proposed a 10-year defense budget that modestly increased, not even in real terms, defense budgets over the next 10 years. And within a couple months, Obama gave a speech saying, let's cut $400 billion from it. Now, which point was he wrong? When his administration submitted the budget, or when he comes in 3 months later and says, let's cut $400 billion? So we say we need to go back at least to that set of budgets that Bob Gates proposed, and somebody says, oh no, we can do it at $100 billion less a year. So, Mr. President, so your administration was $100 billion a year off in the spring of 2011? And if they were, why should we credit anything you say now? If you were that wrong in the spring of 2011, why should we believe you're right in what you're saying now? It's completely indefensible. And one of the things I want is, why in the world have Republicans on Capitol Hill not taken this on directly? The American people don't want interventions all over the world, but they want us to be strong. So I don't get it. The answer to the Chinese is a big part of it is the answer to what we need to do, which is restore the foundation of America's effectiveness in foreign affairs, which is a robust, well-sized and shaped, well and efficiently run armed forces. It's what deters kinetic aggression directly, and also what gives life and energy and time for the tools of soft power to work. And you see that there's no place that's more manifest than in China, because Kerry is flying off to Beijing to beg them not to build these reefs. And they not only are refusing, I mean, what they're saying is just, it's not even concealed contempt. And the reason is, this is one time I don't blame Kerry, because the balance of power is shifting in their direction, and they know it, and so there is no reason why they should give in to that, and that is the calculus we need to change.
Senator Talent, thank you very much. That was very impressive.
Thank you, Frank.
Maybe I could start with a question that I think you have implicitly accepted, but maybe is a little bit at odds with something you said. You've started with the proposition, which is, I guess, Confucius teachings, that, you want to win by not fighting a war rather than having to fight one if you can avoid it, but you still want to win.
Right.
And what I'm interested in is, particularly in light of the work that you've done on the commission, assessing the various developments that the Chinese have been making, both of the various military kinds you've talked about, economic warfare, information operations, intelligence, political warfare across the board. Would you accept the proposition that what they are about is giving them the option to go to war with the United States if they think it's necessary or they otherwise simply choose to do so. Is that
yeah.
where we now find
Yes,
ourselves?
I don't believe they want to. They're not. Their policy is not to cause a war with the United States, but their policy is to accomplish these things, and to secure their to gain domination over their strategic environment for the reasons that we've said. And they believe that in order to be able to do that, they have to be in a position to credibly threaten the United States and its allies. I mean, the whole concept of deterrence is creating a sense within the enemy that you don't, the enemy, I should say adversary, I really should, because that you don't want, and it's important that you don't want to escalate, but you will. It's what John Foster Dulles said: if we're prepared to fight over Berlin, we won't have to fight over Berlin. And we didn't have to fight over Berlin. And in fact, all these lessons come out of the interwar period, where the people who set up this architecture and these operating principles in the 1945 to 1955 timeframe, they lived through this. And they saw the failure of the other strategy. And they saw what it resulted in and how terrible it was. And they didn't, so they really said it. The mission statement of the United States in foreign policy is to manage, if you want to call it, manage risk so as to prevent both aggression to our vital national interests and escalating armed conflict. And they were effective in doing it during the Cold War, and we have not been effective, particularly in the last 7 years, which is why you are seeing both escalating armed conflict and the actual sacrifice of America's national interests.
Good. Questions? Fred?
Senator, could you talk about Chinese theft of corporate and military secrets and how the theft of American military secrets is being used to advance China's military?
Yeah, they've looted us, and including the defense contractors. And they have a very strategic policy to gain technology through a number of different sources. So cyber is one of them. And the report, I think it was the beginning of last year, from a number of defense contractors that they had been seriously compromised. And one of the things that you have to now plan against is the possibility that they have already, therefore, reconnoitered our capabilities, okay? So apart from what they were able to get and then use themselves, they know there's a real danger that they know what we can do. Now, I have not been read into this at the highest level, so I'm just discussing with with open source kind of stuff. But that isn't the only way. I mean, they're constantly trying to get technology from foreign governments and from foreign countries, and they're very unscrupulous in how they do it. So, for example, you read about businesses want to do business in China, they have to do it with a joint venture, and they have to let them have the technology, right? They have to get so that they can then take it and use it. They do this in a number of ways, and they've been very prolific with it. And we're way behind in part because we're just not. I mean, open societies aren't as good at dealing with this as we'd like to be, and in part because we have come very late to the game through the Bush administration and through the Obama administration in recognizing that we're in a competition and we have to act like it. And really, the George W. Bush administration didn't get it at all. I mean, there was a quadrennial defense review report a couple of times, it may have been 2006. I mean, for a series of those reports, they weren't even mentioning China. I mean, they would use the word, but it wasn't even a concern. And one of the things that fascinates me, because when you ask questions, say, well, they were all focused on the Middle East. And you go, well, look, can we walk and chew gum at the same time? We have this gigantic national security apparatus, so we can't tend to our interests in the Far East at the same time as we're tending to our interests in the Middle East? But the answer is it's a very deliberate policy on their part, and they're using means of all different kinds to accomplish it, and they have seriously compromised us.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Senator, thank you so much. That was awesome. My question refers to Taiwan and strategic ambiguity, a topic that's defined Taiwan for so long. With the U.S. adherence more or less varying from different administrations to a one China policy versus China's one China principle, as Taiwan continues to democratize and as the DPP just won these elections and they view the identity of Taiwan completely differently from the KMT, I wonder if strategic ambiguity in terms of defining what China is will become a source of instability rather than stability in the cross-straits.
Yeah.
And what your thoughts would be on U.S. policy as domestic politics in Taiwan continue to change.
So the longer Taiwan is a democracy and the further it gets away from 1949, the less the people feel like they are Chinese. They identify as Taiwanese. And if you look among young Taiwanese, that's just overwhelming. In addition, as we saw with the way the young people occupied the Taiwanese legislature last year because they were protesting the trade agreement, they are asserting themselves more, and that's reflected in the election of the DPP. So Taiwan is moving, and they can see this in Beijing. It is moving away both culturally, and I think it's logical to believe there's going to be a manifestation of that in terms of policy from this fiction that has allowed Taiwan and China to sort of coexist while saving face, in which we've gone along. Okay. At the same time as that's happening, the disproportion in strength between Taiwan and China militarily is growing more and more in favor of the Chinese. And as far as the United States is concerned, from a logistics standpoint, Taiwan is the hardest because it's the closest to the Chinese mainland, and because China has been devoting so much of its military strength for so many years. The first contingency that they wanted to take up was always the Taiwanese contingency. So we have a situation where the danger is that, you know, the ally, particularly unless it depends on how the new president manages this, something is going to happen which the Chinese want to or feel they have to respond to. And this, you will see then, the military imbalance and our growing weakness manifest itself in fewer options for the president to try and control that. Which is why one of the things I wanted the report to say this year, and I don't think it did, because I think and our commission is going to travel to Taiwan. I wanted to wait till after the elections to say something like this, is that our policymakers need to really think in terms of what this de facto commitment and de jure in terms of legislatively to Taiwan is really going to mean. I remember, if you read Churchill, after the Munich disaster, the British government guaranteed the integrity of Poland. And Churchill said, we didn't keep the commitment to Czechoslovakia when we could have, and now His Majesty's government's made a commitment to Poland and has no hope of being able to keep. Now, I'm not saying, this commitment, I think, is a linchpin of our relationship there. But everybody needs to start thinking about what we need to do to be able to credibly deter China. And I should say, I don't see, with everything else that they're dealing with, I'm not sure that the Chinese leadership wants to push this right now. I'm not seeing this necessarily on the horizon, so my concern more is now with a miscalculation in the short term than some deliberate move on their part. I think they also feel like if they can hold it together at home and be successful in the other things that they're trying to do in the East and South China Sea, eventually Taiwan will fall into the fold without them having to do it. There's a lot of reputational costs to them, a lot of issues with them if they have to move militarily against Taiwan. So I don't want to overplay this, but you have put your finger on a potential renewed source of tension. And the longer I think Taiwan moves away from that period of its origin, the bigger challenge this may be.
Ben?
Senator, I want to ask you a question about Chinese defense exports as a tool of influence. You may have seen an article that came out recently talking about how Chinese military drones are popping up now in places like Iraq and Nigeria and a bunch of other places. And that is due in part, from what I understand, to the fact that our own drones are just harder to come by. And whether you agree that they ought to be harder to come by or not, they simply are. And so a lot of countries are instead in the market for Chinese drones, which are just simpler to purchase for a variety of reasons. Is China making these sorts of transactions as sort of part of their long-term strategic thinking, or is it more just short-term business
I
sense?
think it's more short-term. I mean, they're desperate for markets and exports in the situation their economy's in. I mean, when we looked at this, there was a time when they were much bigger arms exporters than they have been in the last few years. Now, in an individual instance, and what you raise here is a much more difficult question, which is how they see themselves globally. I mean, there is no question that they are taking steps, albeit still pretty small steps, to be able to exert their influence globally outside of their near seas and outside of Asia. And I think that they don't sell arms to a government without believing that that's consistent with their foreign policy and probably trying to use whatever they can to get whatever influence they can out of that. But I wouldn't say that I think it's a major aspect of what they're trying to do in terms of global influence. What I would say is they're definitely developing some expeditionary naval capabilities, and they're using that. They use this anti-piracy thing really to try and get experience. Obviously, the Silk Road, the Asian Development Bank, but again, those are all still fairly Asian-centric, where they're trying to expand their influence that way. And they've actually been a little bit more involved, for example, in Afghanistan and the Middle East. But in most cases, you can link that to some interest that they're trying to protect, like oil in the Middle East. So I would answer that by saying I don't think it's a major aspect of what they're trying to do as a foreign policy. I think it's mostly just business to them, and they'll sell anything. I mean, they backed away because of the Iranian sanctions. We actually were able to keep them from doing a lot of business with Iran. But once our policy took the turn that it took in the last few years, that went out the window.
Dan?
I really have two related questions. On the one hand, I just heard you say, and I think correctly, that under the Chinese point of view, if they go forward without a war for a generation, they'll probably be in a position to basically realize their aims on Taiwan and in the region, because they'll be so much stronger a generation from now if nothing else changes. That's assuming the United States maintains the relative military might. The second question is, what are our policy options if the Frank recommendations and the AEI recommendations about defense spending are ignored by Congress and we continue to have a military that's not up to the requirements of the foreign policy that we aspire to? It seems to me then our options become, if I'm hearing you correctly, very, very dire.
Right.
Yes, and
I mean,
talk about that.
That's
for
my concern. I think the consequences of growing weakness relative to the Chinese. Look, we could get lucky. I mean, there are trends in China that could change that regime for the better. Those of you who are interested in this field as I am may know that the Christian church is growing very quickly in China. Who knows what's going to happen, right? The regime we could see a period of tremendous instability. The regime may not be able to hold it all together. Now, that could be good and bad. So one of the things I pointed out to people is because they said, well, their economy is slowing down, so they won't be able to do this. And well, it hadn't stopped Putin to this point, right? But the other problem is that, remember, they're using this to gain legitimacy with the people. So to the extent that they're not able to deliver on quality of life, they may step up the aggression to show the people that they are delivering on the China dream in that respect. I say in the article that there are basically categorically three kind of options we can do. One of them only short term. Option number one, and that would be at all intelligent, is I describe there as kowtowing to them. Saying, okay, this is going to be your sphere, let's cut a deal. And get the best deal you can get. Now, I don't think we can do that without sacrificing what we have heretofore viewed as vital national interests. They're not going to cut some deal that leaves the Japanese in the Senkakus. for example. And plus which, yes, you do have the Japanese. But we could try that. Look, we could have a president who says, I won't name any names. It doesn't matter. We don't care. And cut the best deal you can get. And you probably could get something out of it. I'm not even going to talk about national honor, which I think ought to count. For the short term, and this is what they're doing, you can pretend, go on the way we're going on, pretending it's effective, and pretending that the balance of power is not shifting against us. And we can continue to do that for a while. And then the third thing is what I say in the article and what I talked to you about, a purposeful multi-track policy designed to deter them without provoking them and through a kind of collective security. And there's no reason not. I mean, I got into before I started ranting about the defense budget, but we are stronger than they are. I mean, we got a lot of, but we have a much more stable political system, for example, right? We have an economy, a fully developed first world capitalistic economy. And yes, I know the irony, but compared to them, they don't have a banking system, right? They don't have a legal system. They've done enormous and consequential environmental damage. I'm not talking about global warming here. I'm talking about Flint, Michigan's water supply all through the thing that they're going to have to pay for. They have a national debt that's 270% of their GDP. Paul Krugman would have loved what they did in response to the goal, because they went heavy in response to, we did $780 billion. They did about $2.5 trillion. And they're paying the price for that now. A lot of that they shuffle around off the books. Yes, people say, well, they had $4 trillion in dollar reserves, in reserves. Yeah, they had. They've blown about a sixth of it. In what, about a year and a half? You guys, it's something like that, okay? It's funny how fast money can go, right? And we have friends, and they don't have friends. There is nobody in the region who's not under their thumb, who wants, not for sentimental reasons, but simply for self-interest, to see American leadership replaced by Chinese leadership. Why in the world would you want that if you're Malaysia or obviously the Philippines, any of these countries? I mean, we're even the most benign, because our vital interests are interests that we're happy to have everybody else enjoy to the same degree we do. We want everybody able to free, trade and travel. Everybody's homeland to be safe, right? So, and these are allies who really were something. And the Chinese know that. So in the long run, we're stronger if we even indicate and get down the road of a purposeful policy. We'll have to see what they do as a leadership. But the problem is, in the meantime, there are potential flashpoints where things can get out of control pretty quickly. Not because you enter into it thinking it's going to happen, but because it happens. And don't underestimate the speed with which decisions have to be made in war today.
Yes, sir. Go ahead. Mike?
Senator, thank you for being here today. Two quick questions. You mentioned trends came up earlier, and you also mentioned before how it's very important not to step on Chinese nationalism or get sideways with the Chinese people, but it doesn't hurt to necessarily push back against the government. What are the messages that our government or even society, American society, can use to cleave?
Or the Congress.
Yeah.
Hong Kong, a perfect opportunity. They've gone back, obviously, on the commitments they made in the basic agreement with the British and really with the rest of the world. And they're not letting Hong Kong have free elections. They're suppressing the press. They're interfering and taking away the rights of the people. And what's wrong with, now again, you always want this as part of the other, you don't want to do it on its own. It's part of the other policies, right? And you always have to ask the linkage question when you come to this sort of thing. I am a person who believes that to validate its leadership and as a matter of its honor and its ideals, the United States needs to make human rights an issue. Your boss has talked a lot about this too. But of course, you're careful in the sense that you want it to be effective in terms of the message you're sending and the impact. But what would be wrong with an undersecretary going to Hong Kong and giving a speech about democracy? The United States will help you, and stopping and seeing one of the dissidents. I think it'd be a perfect chance to do it. And that would ricochet in they wouldn't like that at all. And that gives you a chance to have a real substantive conversation with them. Well, there's some things we don't like. So when you want to talk in a real way, let us know.
One other quick question. So China has put down some military and economic roots in Africa. I'm wondering if you see any negatives from their side, if there's any drawback to them that could help us on either of those fronts.
Yeah, I hope that the people of Africa, get some benefits out of this. From my standpoint, I think as a tool of foreign policy, I'm not particularly concerned. The same thing in Central Asia. They're building all this infrastructure, in Kazakhstan and places like that. Let them do it. That's my attitude. They don't have the money. They built all these cities and roads to no place in China. So now their answer economically is they're going to do the same thing in another country. At least in China, they got the cities and nobody uses them, but they've got them in China. So I'm not saying, obviously I'm oversimplifying, but I don't see that as a major problem. And where they tend to go and they tend to be there for a while, the locals don't like them because they bring in Chinese workers, so they don't get the kind of jobs locally that you want. They often do poor jobs. So I don't think they're getting a huge amount of credibility with that. I feel the same way about the Asian Development Bank. They want to invest in other countries in Asia? Let them do it.
Anybody else? Yes, Carol. Mike?
You alluded, sir, in your presentation that we need a well-run armed forces, and that we learned as a nation a lot in the time frame from 1945 to 1955, and that would include the Korean War negotiations for the end of the war and the creation of the Military Armistice Commission in Korea, et cetera. Have you and your colleagues thought about how to improve military-to-military contact, as well as negotiations, which you just mentioned about what an Assistant Secretary of State might do, by really focusing on the kinds of things that happened in that historical time frame that we need to revisit and make sure our negotiators and our military people are well trained before they go over there?
Yeah, I would say to you that one of the things we've got to do is when we're having discussions with China all the time in different levels. I adverted to this before. Whenever we send somebody from PACOM over to talk to their counterpart, that person, and I don't think this happens very often, that person needs to be obviously fully briefed. And we need somebody from Intel or somebody from State or somebody who knows to say, okay, look, here's what you need to ask about. We'd love to find out about how far along they've got on the training on the new carrier and what challenges they have, so that we have goals, things we're trying to achieve in these discussions, other than the sense that, oh, we're having the discussion, so that means things are getting better. It's like a dysfunctional family that won't confront the real problem. I also think generally in terms of negotiating with China, I think it's very possible, and it ought to be part of what we want to do long term, but you have to set the preconditions so they have an incentive to agree to something that you might be able to agree to. And as long as they're accomplishing what they want without negotiations, why should they negotiate? This is just a matter, I said before, of respect for them. What do we think, that they're getting up every day hoping to be able to sit down and negotiate with the United States? I mean, these are people, whatever else you think of these leaders, these are people who've risen up through structures that have involved competitions of power, that our people can't begin to. These are tough people. They're not sitting there feeling emotionally like they have to be able to talk to us or they can't get through the day. I think some of our people feel that way sometimes. Oh, we ought to talk less with them, frankly. And just say, there's no point in having these mill-to-mill discussions anymore, We're gonna build up our side of the mill-to-mill discussions, and then we'll come back and see you.
Senator, one of the things that has been a perennial problem with those mill-mill conversations is the degree of transparency
Yes.
that we have engaged in, and they have, I think, assiduously not reciprocated. Again, let me just come back to the earlier point. My biggest concern, I have to say, is that that there may be circumstances domestically that prompt them to think they need to engage in conflict, if not with us directly, then with one of our allies. That it is necessary to spike that
Yeah.
nationalism and thereby excuse the behavior of the regime domestically. And what's particularly concerning to me is that this is the year of living dangerously for us,
Yeah.
because they and every other bad guy on the planet has figured out it's a window of opportunity to act
We have a risk
with
gap, a risk hole.
this president in place. So as you look at this as a sort of scenario, I guess I just would be interested in your thoughts, and those of the commission, perhaps, if you can speak to them for that perspective as well, as to what, given that this president is going to be in office for the next 11 months, God help us, we might most usefully be doing, perhaps especially here, to be putting down markers, to be setting out, a strategic
You mean within
messaging.
the influencing world, the think tank world, the Congress,
Yeah.
et cetera? I just think, to the extent that we can do it, as a leadership network within the national security community, showing agreement about basic propositions so that we reinforce the leaders on both sides who want to go down basically the right path. And I think it's there really I think that strategic agreement on that level is there among a lot of people on a bipartisan basis. And then the other thing, Frank, is get the Congress to move on the defense budget. This is the one part of national security that Congress has the lion's share of control over, because it's up to Congress to raise and maintain the armies and navies of the United States. And that kind of a signal that was sent, I know the constraints that we're operating in terms of not wanting to increase the caps on the domestic side. I hope and wish there was some serious thinking about whether what we're getting out of that is worth what we're losing and what we could get with potential agreement with the Democrats if we made some kind of a deal with them. I get it. I know it's unreasonable to demand it, especially in view of the stimulus. $780 billion in stimulus. They didn't spend that 50-50. 99.9% of that went to the non-defense discretionary budget.
Right.
0.1% was spent on MilCon, housing. This is what you ought to be telling them. Oh, it should be 50-50. Well, that's not what you said when you were in control. You didn't spend it 50-50. All $780 billion directly. Now I'm going on another rant, a rabbit hole and a rant. That's me. No, I'm not denying it. I'm just saying, okay, so one way to do this would be to prosecute the case and take them on and use the stimulus as part of the debate. And then with a view towards strengthening your hand so that at the end of the day you can agree to a real increase in the baseline, and you may have to give them something, which from a governance standpoint would be huge. What you would get, of course, I'm a huge believer, Frank, that that in terms of that you trade policy. If you have to trade policy for money, most of the time you do it, because you can usually get the money back if you're determined enough. And in this case, the policy is so important, and the money for the military. So if we could do that, the message we would send would be tremendous. Now, this risk gap is going to continue with the new president. I mean, if he does announce something like this, and they do see the Congress moving, they know, okay, wait a minute, the United States is regathering its strength here. So what are they going to do in the meantime? And I can't tell you that there's any way to eliminate that risk. Decisions have consequences, and we have made bad decisions, and we are in an environment where risk is going to be too high. And you all know, one of the problems is if risks are high and they keep growing, eventually, one of them gets realized. Usually not when you anticipate. I'm going to have to take maybe one more because I have to actually go over to Cannon to.
Last question, Fred.
Quick question. Should the next administration make returning to the Subic Bay Naval Base in the Philippines a priority of its China policy to establish a permanent U.S. military presence in the South China Sea and to stand with their allies?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do that. I think one question that you'd have to, and I don't know this, is you'd have to talk quietly with the Filipino government about what is easiest for them to do. It's the substance of the commitment and the presence that's important. So whether that's Subic Bay or several different bases or some other way, I think you have to add, they just had this Supreme Court case, and fortunately we won it, and the Supreme Court said, yes, they can come back. I think we're establishing 6 or 7 different bases or installations. So I think you have to work with the Filipino government on there, but and I haven't touched on this, the longer term, a greater presence is absolutely essential. And we can do it. I'll give you an example and then I'll wrap up. I think John Lehman really likes this idea a lot, and it's a good one, to build a frigate. You can build a frigate using designs that are out there, I think, for several $100 million a copy. Our shipyards need the work. And to the extent that they can't do it, and at least in the short term, you might want to give a little business to the South Koreans, which is not a bad statement to make anyway. Only after all our shipyards are completely full, I get all that. So just think about that. So if you could build that for $250 million a copy, you could get 4 for $1 billion, right? Which means for $10 billion, you could get 40. And you could put missiles on them and hide them in the coastlines, Allied coastlines, and they're small, they're hard to see. So if you're talking about presence, they could also represent that too. So here Obama has taken, he wanted to go to 2/3 of the Navy patrolling, okay, fair enough, that's about 15 ships, 15 additional ships. The department hasn't been able to do it. By the way, it's absolute conclusive evidence the Navy is too small. When the President of the United States declares as an urgent matter he wants to move the equivalent of 15 to 20 ships into a different region of the world, and the department can't do it for 6 years. Right? But if we built that we could get up to a 350-ship Navy pretty fast. Now, yes, this is not an aircraft carrier. Yes, it's not all that survivable, but it's present. Okay? So there are things that we can do, I think, to move pretty quickly, and in concert with the Filipinos and the Australians, and the Vietnamese, which would be another nice statement to make. There's a whole lot of countries that I think we can work with.
So this is not the literal combat ship being built here.
No.
This is a frigate
Jeez.
being built someplace else.
Talk about fighting the last war, huh, Frank?
Yeah. Amen.
It's this thing about it for a second. It's called the littoral combat vessel. So it only operates littorally.
Littorals. Yes, indeed.
Because I was-
Senator, again,
I can't-
thank you very much.